yesterday, we mentioned that the main mitzvah of saying Shema, at least biblically, according to Rebbe, is the first verse, Shema Yisrael. And for that verse, he would put his hand over his eyes. And that is the source that we put our hands over our eyes. And the reason for that is simply because he wanted to concentrate. And even though he gave his lesson and he was in the middle of teaching Torah, and he missed the time to say the full Shema, but he made sure during the time of the Shema, during the time that one's supposed to recite the Shema, he made sure to put his hands over his eyes in order to accept the yoke of heaven by saying at least the first verse, which probably means the first two verses, because Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso Li'olam Va'ed seems to go hand in hand with the Shema Yisrael. And so, although I didn't see it clearly written, I'm assuming that he would say both, the Shema Yisrael and the Baruch Shem. Although I'm not 100% sure, because the Gemara does say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. This is the Kriya Shema of Reb Yehuda. So Reb Yehuda Anasi. So I'm not 100% sure, but it would seem that Baruch Shem goes hand in hand. And my source that Baruch Shem, Shema Yisrael, and Baruch Shem go hand in hand is brought in Shulchan Aruch. In Shulchan Aruch, it talks about making the interruptions that our Gemara is about to discuss. We mentioned it in the Mishnah. When can you interrupt if someone greets you or you want to greet someone? And the law is that during the Shema, you are allowed to interrupt certain times. However, in Shulchan Aruch, it says that you could even interrupt in the middle of a pasuk, except for Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusa Li'olam Va'ed. That Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem both have, you're not allowed to interrupt at all between them and during them. And unless you're afraid of someone killing you, of course, it's life and death. Every mitzvah is over. We override every mitzvah for except the big three for Pikuach Nefesh. Now, in the Mishnah Brura, he brings down that nothing is greater than accepting the yoke of heaven. And because of this reason, you shouldn't interrupt in between Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay, which is also included in the Yichud, in the unity of Hashem, the Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay. So somehow Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem sort of fall into the same category and are one in, it's like one entity. You can't even interrupt in between the two. So because of that, I'm assuming that Rebbe, when it says he would say Shema Yisrael, it includes Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay, although I am still trying to research it. The next piece of Gemara mentioned that there was a question if Rebbe actually would complete the entire Shema afterwards, even though he missed the time. But he gave his class during those 3 hours that a person is supposed to recite the Shema, and he would be reciting. He would be giving over a class, and it probably he started it before he was allowed to say the Shema. So he must have started the class either at dawn or at the time that the earliest time to say Shema. The preferable time, which would be Misha Yakir, when a person can recognize someone, an acquaintance between about 4 cubits, which is about 6 to 8 feet away. So that would be like the preferable time to recite Shema, somewhere between there and the 3 hours in the day. It seems like he was the entire time giving his class. And so the question was, did he actually complete the whole Shema later after the time of Shema? Would he? And the Gemara says it's an argument. Bar Kapara says he definitely would. I'm sorry, he definitely wouldn't. And Reb Shimon the son of Rebbe, said he definitely would. Yes, Ben, you have a question.
I have a question about it. If he was giving the class between the time that before you can say it until after you can say it, what about all his students? What do they do?
So yesterday I answered that by saying that it seems like they would probably excuse themselves during the class for a few minutes.
Okay.
And during that time, they probably would say the Shema. I guess it's easier to give a class than to listen. And the students had they probably had to leave for a few minutes here, and so when they left, they took their little break. Yes, Yehuda.
Yeah, but if you're performing a mitzvah, aren't you exempt from another mitzvah? They were learning Torah.
So that's a good question. The mitzvahs that you're exempt from are generally mitzvahs that aren't the mitzvahs you're exempt from are certain ones. You're not exempt from every mitzvah.
Oh, okay.
So Shema would be an example where you're not exempt. That would be an example. A good source. So I'm going to have to take back what I said earlier. I guess when it says Shema Yisrael, it's Shema Yisrael alone. In order to fulfill the biblical mitzvah, it would just be enough to say Shema Yisrael. And the reason I'm saying that is I see both in this when they quote this law of Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch, they also don't seem to mention anything about Baruch Shem. No, the commentaries don't seem to say anything. Okay, maybe this is a good source. In any event, the Gemara, after it spoke about this idea of do you finish the Shema later, then the Gemara spoke about mentioned the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim, that there is an inyan, there is seems like it's a law that a person should mention the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, together with Shema, and it's brought here in Shulchan Aruch as well. So it seems that that would be the way to go. That if a person is only doing the one pasuk, Shema Yisrael, he should also mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, and it's brought in the Mishnah Berurah, brought in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. So that seems like that's an important law, even though from the Gemara, maybe you could say that Rebbe was extra stringent. Maybe it's not, but the Gemara seems to, the Shulchan Aruch seems to take it as a law that that a person should say the Exodus from Egypt, mention it in the time of the Shema, connected to the Shema. Then the Gemara afterwards said about if a person is falling asleep, how careful do you have to be to try to say Shema while you're awake? And we said that that of course you always have to say all the words of the Shema, but if you're not understanding what you're saying, you should try at least the first verse. That's really the most important part, and they used to have their servant wake them up to make sure they're wide awake, at least for the first verse, Sukkah Kama, and that's very important to have kavana for it, to have understanding for. And then we talked about lying down when you're saying Shema, even maybe if you're on your side, is that, so we mentioned that the common understanding, the common understanding of the Gemara is if you're lying on your side, totally, that's not a problem. But if you're on your back and you're just leaning a little to the side, you really should not be saying Shema, because it looks like you are arrogant. And we mentioned also about sleeping in such positions as well as other issues, lying on your back, lying on your face, that there's a problem of sleeping like that. And we said Shema would also be a problem for different reasons, but it would also be a problem. Again, for Shema, the reason not to lie on your back would not be because, a person might have an erection. That would be a reason not to sleep on your back. It wouldn't be a reason not to say Shema that way. Not to say Shema that way would be a sign of arrogance. Well, it's a different reason. It would be the same law, but it would be a different reason behind it. And the Gemara said even if you're slightly moving off your back to your side, that would also be a problem to say Shema because you still look like you're arrogant and haughty, and therefore really should be totally on your side is okay, at least according to the main common understanding of the Gemara. We did say another understanding of the Gemara that even on your side, that only applies if you're sleeping, if you're in bed without pajamas, without clothing, then that would be, then that's the case where you are allowed to say Shema on your side. But normally, even on your side is not allowed at all. And we would just, because a person doesn't have clothing, we're not going to make him get up and get clothing and so on. So therefore, he would be allowed to say Shema on his side. And there's also some technical rules of what that means. He doesn't have clothing. There are some technical laws that would be applicable, which I'm not going to get into. Now, we also said that if a certain person is very, very fat, like Rabbi Yochanan, he was allowed to lie on his back and lean a little to the side and say Shema that way, because by him you could tell that he wasn't doing it for haughtiness and arrogance. He was doing it because it simply couldn't move. It was hard for him to move totally on his side, and therefore for him it didn't show arrogance, and therefore he was allowed to do it that way. And the same thing would apply to anyone who is in such a position where it's visible that they can't, that it's hard for them to move fully to their side. Yes, Ben.
I have a question about it. If you're laying down to say Shema, still saying Shema, what do you do with the yarmulke? How do you keep your yarmulke on your head?
So you either wear a baseball cap,
or do you need to have a yarmulke?
Wear a bobby pin, or you're in a position.
I have a pin, but it still slips, so I don't know.
So you might want to go get it's easy if you have a lot of hair, it stays on. The yarmulke stays on.
Right.
As you get older and you don't have less hair, and I'm starting to get that way, you got to get a bigger yarmulke. Yeah. So when you get a bigger yarmulke, then it stays on. You have to get one that holds tight. They also sell some type of.
But you need.
Yeah.
Why can't the yarmulke when you're laying down too?
Oh, well, Ezra wants to say maybe a pillow is good enough. Maybe the fact that you're on your pillow, that's your head is covered. I guess you're right. I don't know. I never thought about it. If I don't do that, is that kosher? Maybe. Yeah. I guess a cap.
I just wondered. Okay, thank you.
I guess he's got a good point. I don't know that should the yarmulke be more visible, that it's for the purpose of a yarmulke or at least a cap, or is a pillow good enough? I guess that's a homework for tomorrow. We got our homework. So.
I was also happy to hear that the Shulchan Aruch gave the same answer that I came up with for David.
That what?
Why the Shema is said first before the Tefillah.
The Shema is said first before the Tefillah, and what was the answer?
The answer was that Shema, Hashem is talking to us, and Tefillah we are talking to Hashem. That's what you just read from the Shulchan Aruch.
Okay. Did I just read that?
So Tefillah is not, Tefillah lo docha Shema. Shema docha Tefillah.
Well, we were talking about Torah. Torah, what overrides Torah? Torah study, or does Torah study override? So we said Shema overrides Torah study, but Torah study overrides Tefillah. That's what we said.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know if it's exactly what you were saying, but if you want, we'll give you the credit.
No, I heard you say Shema too. So, but anyhow.
Yeah, I don't
know.
Yesterday
we talked about it.
Okay.
I think Ben's referring to. Oh, Ben's referring to that you said that in the Tefillah, we're mostly asking Hashem for our requests.
Rachamim.
So
right.
Yeah, so that comes
implies.
second. That comes second to Shema, which is us praising Hashem, not asking Hashem to fulfill our requests.
Okay, all right. So I guess you're right, Ben. I guess that's right. Thank you, David. Okay, now if everyone has 5 minutes extra, we will do the next piece of Gemara because I really wanted to finish the page. Does everyone want to give 5 minutes? Yeah, is that okay? We'll go a little over time. Okay. This is real lishma because we're not getting paid for this. Real lishma for the sake of heaven. Now you're really learning for the right reason. Okay, v'prakim. So we said v'prakim shayel v'chulu. But in the Mishnah mentioned that there are times that you are allowed to interrupt in the middle of Shema, and it depends if you're in between paragraphs, then it's very easy to interrupt. And if you're in the middle of a paragraph, it's a little harder to find an exemption to interrupt, but there's also cases where you could interrupt. There was an argument in the Mishnah. One rabbi said that if you're in between paragraphs, then you can interrupt for what purpose? For kavod, someone you need to honor, or you want to honor, you're supposed to honor. And if you're in the middle of a paragraph, then you can interrupt someone you're supposed to fear. And we said there are different opinions what that means, fear, but the simple understanding would be someone who is a mitzvah for you to fear, like your parent, a teacher, and so on. That type of person you could interrupt in the middle of a paragraph. Again, interrupt in between paragraphs, someone you want to honor, someone who deserves respect, maybe a scholar, and in between paragraphs, someone that you want to fear. Then there was another opinion in the Mishnah that said that you can interrupt by greeting someone in between paragraphs, someone you need to honor. But if you're answering a greeting, then you don't have to have an excuse to honor any person. You could answer a greeting if you're in between the paragraphs, two paragraphs. But if you're in the middle of a paragraph, then you could greet someone who you need to fear, but you could reply to a greeting for anyone you need to honor. So it was a little more lenient about replying, according to that other view, that you could reply to someone. So now we're going to read the Gemara, and uveprakim shayel v'chol. So
Rabbi
we're now 6 lines up from the bottom. Yes.
I'm just clarifying that this interrupting that you're talking about is regarding like a freestanding Shema, not a Shema that's part of a full Shachris.
No,
correct.
We're talking about you're part of the full Shachris.
Oh, because in the full Shachris, you're not supposed to be talking between Baruch Shamar and at least at the end of Shemon Esrei, or the last Kaddish.
So this Gemara tells us that there are reasons where you could interrupt. And I'm not telling you that this is applicable nowadays to our davening, because nowadays we don't normally interrupt in the middle of davening. So people understand that you're not answering to their greeting. But according to the letter of the law, it would apply to in the middle of your full-fledged davening.
Wow.
Okay? So the Gemara says, Meishiv machmas mai. Why is a person answering, according to the first opinion, that it said you can, again, the first opinion said that in between chapters, you can greet someone who you deserve to honor, and you could answer them. Now, isn't that obvious? You could answer them. If you could greet them, of course, you could reply to a greeting. So this is what the Gemara is dealing with. So the Gemara says, Beprokim, Meshiv, we're on the 6th line up from the bottom of the page. Meshiv machmas mai. Why would you be, what are you answering? What are you replying for? What purpose? What is the reason you're, if it's because the person deserves your honor. So hashto now, mishal shoil, you're allowed to greet him in the first place. Ahadure mi boy. Is it questionable if you could reply to him? If you could interrupt to ask him to greet him, for sure you could reply. Ella shoyel mipnei hakavod. Rather, it must mean that you can greet him, someone you deserve to honor. In between two separate paragraphs, you can greet someone. Umeishiv shalom l'chol adam. It must mean that you would be allowed to reply. Umeishiv, it just says vaguely, and you could reply. It must mean you could reply to anyone. Because what else would it mean reply? Of course, you could reply to a guy that you could initially greet. Of course, you could reply to such a person. There's no question. Why would the Mishnah say that? It must mean that you could reply to any person. Ema seifa. Then the Gemara says, let's look at the next case, the end case. Uve emtza, if you're in the middle of a paragraph, shoyel b'bnei hayira umeshiv. You can greet someone who you have to fear, and you could reply to them if they greet you. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? Of course, you could reply to someone if they greet you, if you could greet them in the first place. Meishiv machmas mai. What are you replying for? What reason? Why would you? What is it referring to that you're allowed to reply in the middle of a paragraph? Ilema, if you will say mipnei hayira, because for someone who you're allowed to greet because you fear them because of fear, hashta mishal shoil. Now you could greet them in the first place. Ahadure mi boy. You to reply would be a question. Of course, you could reply to such a person if you could greet someone that because of fear. So for sure, you could reply to such a person. Ella, rather, it must mean that you're replying one step below that. That you're replying, even someone you just want to honor, that person you could reply to. Ella b'bnei hakavod. So now the Gemara says, if we translate the Mishnah to mean this, then this will be a big problem because Hainu de Reb Yehuda. Then that ends up being the opinion of Reb Yehuda de Tanan, because we learned in the Mishnah, Reb Yehuda says, the emtza, in the middle of a paragraph, you're in the middle of a paragraph, shoyel b'bnei hayira umeishiv b'bnei hakavod. You can greet someone who you have to fear, and you reply to them, the person that you want to honor. In biprakim, and in between paragraphs, shoyel b'bnei hakavod, you can greet someone who you want to honor, umeishiv shalom l'chol adam, or who you're obligated to honor, and meishiv shalom l'chol adam, and you can reply to any person. So we can't say that Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda say the same thing, because in the Mishnah, it clearly demonstrates that they're arguing. So what does Reb Meir mean when he says you could greet someone who you have to fear and you could reply? You could greet someone who you have to honor and you could reply. Why does he end off with that? And you can reply. Obviously, you can reply if you could greet them. So that's what the Gemara is bothered with. And the Gemara answers, Chasure mechsera, the Mishnah is missing words, Vahachi katani. And this is what it means to say. Beprakim, in the middle of two chapters, Shoyel mipnei hakavod, you could greet someone who you have to honor. Ve'ein tzarech laimar shehu meishiv. You have to add a few words in the Mishnah. And for sure, you could reply. Uve'emtza, and in the middle of a paragraph, Shoyel b'mnei hayira, you request, you could greet someone who you have to fear. Ve'ein tzarech laimar shehu meishiv, and for sure, you can reply. In other words, then the Mishnah says, Ein tzarech laim. You have to add these words to the Mishnah, meaning that you have to understand the Mishnah as if it added these words. Not that the Mishnah is missing words, but that you have to read between the lines. You have to add a little understanding to the words. Divrei Reb Meir, these are the words of Reb Meir. Reb Yehuda Aimer, Reb Yehuda says, Be'emtza shoyel b'bnei hayira umeishiv b'bnei hakavod. And then Reb Yehuda argues, and he says, in the middle of a paragraph, you can greet someone because of fear. And you can reply because of someone you need to honor. And in between two paragraphs, you can greet someone who you have to honor, and you could reply to a greeting to any person. So that gives a little clarity on the Mishnah and the argument between these rabbis. I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time.
No.
If anyone wants to ask any questions, you may.